And I will open the room in 3, 2, 1. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to give people a couple minutes to trickle in and be let in here. And while we're waiting, I wanted to find out from the audience what languages the students or families that you interact with speak. That might give us an idea of the context that you're working in, and maybe some of the resources that we can send your way after the webinar is complete. So feel free to drop your answer in the chat, and we'll get started in just a minute. Good afternoon. Just going to reiterate what I just mentioned. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and we'd love to hear what languages your students and families speak. That will help us have some context for where you're coming from today. And thank you, Katie, for sharing that your students speak Portuguese, Spanish, and Haitian Creole. And I see Yassine, thanks for being here. And Heather, yes, Spanish, a lot of Spanish. Oh, we got some Arabic speakers in French. I'm very excited to see that. Thank you, Latifa. All right. I don't know if any of you have Ukrainian students. My daughter has a couple of classmates who joined her school last year. All right. Okay, so we are at 4:03. So let's go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone. Again, my name is Ruth, and I'm the Education Policy and Program Coordinator at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. And we're so thankful for all of the work that you are doing with and for English learner students. We are here to talk today about the long-held rights of English learner students and how educators can ensure these rights are protected and that students receive the resources they need to participate equally and meaningfully in public schools. So before we launch into our conversation today, just a note about terminology. I'd like to point out that we are aware that the term English learner or EL is a deficit-based term, and it focuses on what the student does not have, which is presumably English proficiency. But in the education field, as you all know, it is more common to hear these students referred to as multilingual learners or emergent bilinguals, which is an asset-based perspective that is much more accurate since these students are likely already proficient in one or more languages. So for the purpose of this webinar and for clarity, we will use the term English learner because this is how students learning English are referred to in federal law. So today we'll be speaking with 4 different panelists, and there will be a Q&A in the final 10 minutes of the webinar. Please feel free to submit your questions and our team will send them to me when it's time for the Q&A. So don't worry if they don't get answered in the chat right away, they're probably going to get filtered and sent over to me. So now I'd like to introduce our first panelist, my colleague Niyati Shah, who is the Director of Litigation here at AAJC. So welcome. Thanks for being here with us. I'd like to ask the first question, which is, what is your connection to or interest in the work of supporting English learners?
Thanks. Thanks, Ruth. And it's so good to be with everybody to talk about this incredibly important issue. I will say that Asian Americans and English learner needs go hand in hand. We know that more than 20% of all people in the United States over the age of 5 speak a language other than English at home. And 11%, or close to 5 million students enrolled in the public pre-K through 12 schools are English language learners. And as I mentioned at the outset, they are predominantly students from Asian American and Latino communities. And so both from an organizational perspective, this is something that really touches our communities and is very important to us. And on a personal level, as a young student, I was in the ESL program. And so for all of these reasons, I think it is a lot both it's very important both in terms of personal and professional to make sure that this issue is doesn't lose focus and isn't lost in the shuffle.
Thanks so much. Yeah, right now with a lot of the various difficulties that the education system and teachers are experiencing, there's a lot to juggle. And so I want to bring to attention the resources that were created recently in partnership with organizations that are presented here as our panelists. Can you tell me why these resources were created? What's the significance of having knowledge of English learner rights at this time?
Right. So in August of 2025, so last summer, the Department of Education quietly rescinded guidance to school communities about how to meet their legal obligations towards students who are English learners and their families or guardians who may also be limited in their English proficiency. There wasn't a big splash or anything like that, but it was rescinded, and it may have created an impression that these laws don't apply, that there's no longer a requirement. But that is not, in fact, true. The legal rights of English learner students and or their families who may be limited English proficient still have rights under federal law, and it's important that they're aware of them because at least at minimum, by rescinding this guidance, it certainly seemed to signal that if a family member was impacted or a student was impacted, that they wouldn't find support with the Department of Education. So it is important to know that these rights exist, that as educators in school communities, that you're aware that nothing in terms of the law has changed and to not turn your back on these students and their families.
Thanks so much. So what I'm hearing is the law hasn't changed. Okay,
100%
so we're
accurate.
confirming that the law hasn't changed. These rights are still protected. And we are here in this discussion to help educators figure out how to implement these resources so that these students' rights are protected. Thanks so much, Niti, and thanks also for sharing your personal connection to this work. I'd like to bring in our next panelist. His name is Naveen Pant. He comes to us today as staff counsel at the Office of General Counsel at the National Education Association, or NEA. And he also brings years of experience as the former Deputy Chief, U.S. Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division, and he works specifically in the Educational Opportunities section. So welcome, Naveen. Thanks for being with us this afternoon.
Thanks, Ruth. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Well, could you tell us a little bit about your connection to or interest in the work of supporting English learners?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I was at the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division for about a decade, and while I was there, I worked on a lot of cases involving the rights of English learners under a law called the Equal Educational Opportunities Act. And I saw, how much of a difference the right type of programs and supports could make in the success of English learner students. And I learned from educators how much of an asset English learner students were to school communities at large, and how we should view English learners not as a problem to be solved, but rather a community to be included. And, what I saw from those experiences really resonated with me and my own values, that it's really important to have inclusive and thriving public education for all students, and that English learners are part of that equation.
Yeah, we'll get into it a little more in a bit because I'd love to hear more about your field work when you actually went to school sites to work with teachers and students to ensure that they're getting what they need. Um, I was wondering if you could answer, how do you see these laws, which give English learners rights, as also empowering to educators and school administrators?
Yeah, so I mean, history shows that educators have been at the very forefront of advocating for what they and their students need to be successful. And this is very much the case with English learners as well. Educators have long advocated for English learner supporting legislation and education policies. So, under the law, school districts and states have an obligation to ensure equal educational opportunities for English learner students. And as Nidhi mentioned, that is still the law, despite what this administration may suggest otherwise. And it's important for educators to advocate for ensuring that those needs are met, so that English learners in the broader school community thrive. NEA has a resource on how educators can do just that, which I see you dropped in the chat. And some examples to keep in mind in terms of, what the law requires. It requires qualified teachers and training, access to grade level curricula, access for English learners to all facets of school life, including extracurricular programs, AP programs, gifted and talented programs, special education services. And it requires schools to monitor if the programs are working. So these are just examples, but things that educators can keep in mind as they think about how best to advocate for their students.
Great. Yeah, I know sometimes when we say something like English learners have rights and they need to be fulfilled, it can feel a little bit it can feel a little bit like pressuring educators, but the angle that I want to take today, which you explained, is that because English learners have rights to these resources, educators have the backing, the legal backing to request those resources. So if an educator wants to get additional certification or go through professional development, these are legitimate requests that an educator can make to help them be equipped to serve their students well. Um, so, in a time when many school districts have already been facing inadequate funding or new funding cuts, there may be a lot of gaps in terms of what's available to educators to meet the needs of their English learner students. And in the chat here, we've got educators that are serving communities that speak Arabic, in addition to Spanish, Haitian Creole, and some of these languages are harder to accommodate and to meet the needs of those students. So, from your experience, what are ways that you've seen districts or schools close these gaps? Do you have any anecdotes that you can share with us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think first and foremost, schools and districts have to be intentional about closing the gaps. Otherwise, the gaps will persist. And I think educators have a real role in ensuring that districts and schools close the gaps. And I think the short answer is through advocacy. And I think educators can be informed on the law. Again, remembering that federal law mandates that students have access to the curriculum and that there are criteria for English learner programs and that students have rights under these laws that they're entitled to enforce. Um, and I think, that's really important that sometimes it can feel to educators like it's just up to individual teachers to bridge the gap, but this really needs to be a school-wide district-wide, really a community-wide effort to ensure that English learners are included in the community. Um, and I think that means engaging with others, colleagues, families, community members, When I was at DOJ and I went on site visits and I interviewed teachers and administrators, I saw so many teachers doing their absolute best to serve students and families who don't speak English. For example, I remember interviewing a teacher who was very emotional about the toll her students were facing, and many of those students were from Guatemala and spoke primarily indigenous Mayan languages, um, and didn't actually speak Spanish. And they were facing all kinds of challenges, both in school as being Latin American students who didn't speak Spanish, as well as at home. Um, and I saw she was doing her best. But really, to get the enduring changes that students need and that communities need, it involves more than just one teacher doing their best. It involves teachers and administrators and community members banding together and demanding that school districts and states, and that's an important part of this. States also have their own obligations. Give teachers the tools that they need, which include research-based models, professional development, data collection tools, and importantly, the time and the space to coordinate English language development as a standalone course. Um, so yeah, it really does take teachers to band together, educators to band together with the community at large to advocate for these services.
Thanks so much. And I'm so glad that you're at NEA right now because that means that educators can have a direct channel, not necessarily that they're going to be blowing up your email today, but that there's someone that's reachable and who is there to serve specifically the educator community and who understands those needs, rather than having to maybe file an OCR complaint to be able to get to you and to get some help. So, and I know in a previous conversation you and I had, you discussed that there were some maybe unconventional ways of serving English learners in the community that you were referring to. And one of them was to create culturally sustaining practices. So it wasn't just, let's say, bringing interpreters or creating translations, but there is, I think you mentioned perhaps inviting community members, Guatemalan community members to participate in school activities or um, looping them in so that it wasn't just students and then an English speaking teacher who was struggling to meet their needs. Does that sound right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and I would say, um, I'm not sure I would characterize them as unconventional. They may not be practiced broadly, but I would say that they are very much supported by research, which is to ensure that the way you're teaching and what you're teaching is inclusive and meets the needs of all students. And I did see that. I did see in schools that there were teachers and schools that were ensuring that the curricula met the needs of all their students, and that can take lots of different forms. It can, as you alluded to, can include members of the community actually participating in school and talking about what life is like back home and interacting with students. It can include references to things that students know from their native countries in even like a math class. So that it can take lots of different forms, and I saw teachers being creative about that. With the overall goal of including students of all different backgrounds in their class.
Great point. Yeah, it's maybe unconventional was not the most accurate word, because these culturally sustaining practices have been discussed and researched and taught for several decades now, but like you mentioned, may not always be implemented. And we would definitely encourage educators, if you haven't dug into ethnic studies framework, multicultural studies framework, and community responsive pedagogical methods. Those are amazing resources. And I've been on the receiving end of some professional development in these areas and felt as an adult learner like it was very impactful. So thank you so much, Naveen. I appreciate your time today.
Absolutely.
Um, I'm going to introduce our third panelist. Her name is Francisca Fajana. She is the Director of Racial Justice Strategy at Latino Justice. So welcome.
Thank you for having me. Good
Yes,
afternoon, all.
good afternoon. Could you share very briefly what your connection is to or interest in the work of supporting English learners?
Absolutely. Latino justice. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I
Can you hear me?
think perhaps yes, if you want to turn off the camera so that the sound is easier, that's fine. There you go. Okay, you can go ahead and
Okay.
share.
So to answer your question, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes?
yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Latino Justice, the civil rights organization that I work for, its origin story actually began with a language access case. In 1972, when Latino Justice was first founded as the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, the very first case that it litigated was called Aspira of New York versus the New York City Education Department. It was a case about the denial of language access to Puerto Rican and other Latino students who were Spanish language dominant. Case was filed at about the same time that Lau Nichols was filed. Lau versus Nichols is the case decided by the Supreme Court in 1974 that established the rights of non-English speakers to language access. So, Aspira of New York versus the New York City Education Department was filed at about the same time. Lao was filed on the West Coast. Aspira was filed on the East Coast. Lao was on behalf of Asian American students, and Aspira was on behalf of Latinx students or Latino students. Both sets of students were facing the same kinds of challenges, except that one group of students were Chinese speaking and the other were Spanish speaking. In the same year that the Supreme Court decided Law versus Nichols, the Aspira case settled. The Aspira case, like Lau, was a landmark decision for language access in New York State. It established the rights to bilingual education for English language learners. I know that the preferred terminology is multi-language learners or multilingual learners. But I'm going to use the English language learners because, as you said, that's mostly what's is in the legal landscape. The right to bilingual education remains so. It was established in 1974 when the Aspira case settled, but that right remains the law in New York State. That's Latino Justice's interest in language access. We continue to litigate a lot of language access related cases in the education space and in other contexts as well.
So it's really fundamental to the organization that you work for, right? This language access concern. Thank you so much for sharing about that and how that settlement, the things that it achieved, are still there today. And so I think that goes to show how important it is when these decisions are made and how durable those impacts can be. So thank you. And do you have, can you explain, do English learners have rights only under federal law, or are there provisions at the state level?
Yes. So English language learners have rights under both federal law and state laws. So for in New York State, for example, education law section 3204 and part 154 of the Commissioner's regulations contain detailed standards for identifying English language learners and for providing them with services. I'm going to highlight three three requirements under those two laws. So one is, these are all rules that most of the folks in the audience are familiar with. But just to reiterate, particularly in this climate where, we have an executive order that professes that English is now the official language of the United States. And as Nate said, there's been the Department of Justice has rescinded guidance on for limited English proficient populations. So, just to reiterate, school districts are still required to provide bilingual programs in core subjects like math, science, and social studies. Students are expected to receive instruction in both in their home language and in English. They are not required to forget their home language at the schoolhouse door. So that's one reminder. The second is school districts may also assign ELL students to English as a new language program, depending on how they perform on state assessments. The regulations are very clear on how many hours of instruction students should receive and for how long before they reach proficiency. And then last but not least is school districts are still mandated to provide support services to students who are struggling. So students still have access to bilingual education based on the Aspira consent decree, the Aspira litigation that was filed. That remains the law for more than 30 years at this point, more than 50 years at this point. I'll stop there.
So, thank you for sharing that. And I want to clarify that what you mentioned, that is in New York State, right? The Aspira case.
Yes,
Mhm.
that's in New York State. And the right to bilingual education remains the law in New York State.
Great. So I think that it's worth noting that the federal law is kind of like the baseline, right? It's just a reference point for what is required for supporting EL students. But there are many states, including New York, that have their own state level laws to ensure that there's robust support and robust funding allocated for students. So it's um, important to check that out because it could be that educators here in this audience have access to more resources than they realize, and it's mostly because things get lost in the mix. If there's no advocacy for certain things, each day just passes by, and sometimes we don't realize what resources or what agency we do have available to us. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'd like to introduce our last panelist today. His name is Michael Polera, who was a major contributor to creating the resources that we are sharing today. For example, the FAQ sheet. He is the director of the Educational Opportunities Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And he also brings with him many years of experience as a former senior civil rights attorney at the Department of Education. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Ruth. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a privilege to be here with all of you.
So I'm going to ask you the question that I asked all the other panelists to start with is what is your connection or interest in the work of supporting English learners?
Well, as you indicated, I've been an education civil rights lawyer for more than a decade. At Lawyers Committee, my focus is entirely on ensuring students receive equal educational opportunities. And before this, as you said, I served at the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, where I investigated and resolved complaints of discrimination and drafted policy and resources focused on the rights of students who are English learners. And in every capacity, it has been abundantly clear to me how important both legal protections and sufficient resources are for students who are English learners. Start out kind of talking about a little bit about the history of legal protections regarding students who are English learners and sort of what's happened over the past year or so. So I think in this space, a good starting point For discussion is 1970, when the former U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which is the predecessor to what is now the U.S. Department of Education, issued a memo which was clear about the rights of students who are English learners. That memo clarified specifically that Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 requires schools to provide an equal opportunity to students who are English learners, as well as provide guardians with limited English proficiency adequate notification of school activities. And then, as Fran referenced, in 1974, in Lao, the US Supreme Court confirmed that understanding of Title VI, confirming that memo. And in that case, the Supreme Court stated, very importantly, there is no equality of treatment merely by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum. For students who do not understand English are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education. That same year, following the Supreme Court's ruling, the Equal Educational Opportunities Act of 1974 was signed into law, which, among other things, specifically requires states and schools to take appropriate action to overcome language barriers that impede equal participation by students in a school's instructional programs. And for more than 50 years, the U.S. Department of Education and the U.S. Department of Justice confirmed the rights of students who are English learners again and again through numerous Dear Colleague letters, fact sheets, and other resources. And both agencies enforced the law through investigations and resolutions that ensured students who are English learners had full access to their rights. Both 5 decades ago and today, federal civil rights law requires schools to provide appropriate language assistance services to students who are English learners that enable them to become proficient in English and participate equally and meaningfully in the standard instructional program of a school. And 5 decades ago through today, federal civil rights law requires schools to ensure meaningful communication with parents and guardians who have limited English proficiency in a language they can understand. The Department of Education has unfortunately walked away from its obligation to protect the rights of students who are English learners, announcing essentially that it is not in line with their policy. And that is it's certainly distressing development, especially where we find ourselves in 2026 with so many children facing increasing hostility at school or unable to access school at all due to other actions of the federal government. But the law has not changed, as has been said today. Students continue to have rights for meaningful participation in education, and guardians continue to have rights to meaningful communication.
I know that Ruth is back, and I'm going to turn it over to her. But as I do that, Michael, so then with this rich history of protections by the federal government that you've just set forth, what's changed in the last year?
Yeah, as far as what's changed, it's really just behavior of the federal government, of the Department of Education with respect to the enforcement. As I said, they kind of walked away from their statutory obligations to enforce federal civil rights law. But to be, unequivocally and repetitive here, the law has not changed. The rights remain the same.
Thanks, Niyati. I think my kid accidentally unplugged the Wi-Fi, so I'm back. I'm back. So thank you for your patience. I like how you said that only the behavior has changed, so maybe the attitude has changed, but again, the law still exists. So rights are still protected. Educators still have the right also to request what they need for their students. Um, do you have advice for our audience today? Well, let me back up. Are there any laws that provide funding specifically to support English learners? Because, of course, we can ask all day for what we want, but a lot of times the answer is, oh, well, it's not in the budget. Is that really true? Is it really not in the budget?
Well, to the question of is there funding under federal law to support English learners, the answer is yes, there is. Though I should add, there certainly should be more funding. As a matter of law, though, Title III of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act awards funding to states, which then flows to school districts, specifically for the purpose of improving the education of students who are English learners. Worth noting that this funding is required to supplement or add to what students are entitled to based on federal civil rights law. And quickly, why I said there needs to be more funding. I just want to reiterate the data points here, right? English students who are English learners make up more than 11% of students across the country. That's more than 5 million students in this country. And in many states, it's much more than 11%. It's 20% or even more in some states.
Yeah, for example, in Texas, definitely. Um, and we have a question that has been shared with me. Um, are any of these laws applicable to adult multilingual learners?
The federal civil rights laws generally apply to students in elementary and secondary education. So
Okay.
the bulk of what I think all of us are discussing today is with respect to elementary and secondary education, PK through 12 schools.
Hmm.
But individuals at higher levels of education do have rights under federal law and maybe state laws as well. But that's not necessarily the focus of our discussion today.
Gotcha. Okay. And do you have any advice for our audience today? What specifically educators can do to advocate for their students?
Yeah, so federal law, as I'll say, sort of one last time. Maybe I'll say it again. I don't know, but federal law continues to guarantee the rights of students who are English learners and guardians with limited English proficiency. And on top of that, as Fran so helpfully shared, in many states, state law guarantees these rights as well. Maybe even more rights than federal law covers. So advocate for the rights of those in your classrooms and in your school. In many circumstances, advocating can lead to solutions. And in a time where the federal government is not fulfilling its obligations to enforce civil rights, there also may be other places to turn: civil rights organizations, lawyers, legal aid organizations, and state government agencies. And from my experience, it is very often teachers and other members of school staff who reach out and who file complaints on behalf of students. Educators are experts on the needs of their students, and to be clear, while complaints are sometimes required to resolve issues, very often issues can be resolved just by reminding folks of legal requirements. So share out the information that you've heard today and share out the resources that our organizations have put together. And also to respond to one question I saw in the chat briefly, to be clear, federal civil rights laws generally prohibit retaliation against individuals, including teachers, who advocate for the civil rights of students.
Thanks so much for answering that question. I wanted to add that advancing justice on our education team, we're in touch with a lot of local state level education advocacy organizations. And so we want to tell our audience, educators, administrators, you're not alone. There are community members that care just as much as you do, and we are happy to work with you to see if we can connect you with people in your local area. And in many states, such as in the South where I'm based, our state legislatures are not super friendly right now to increasing funding or increasing implementation of current laws to serve English learners. And so, what I've found is that some community members just go straight to the school board. Maybe it's not a time that it's possible to pass certain laws at the state level, but there are school districts that are friendly to discussion, and I just want to say that you're not alone. There's lots of people here who are interested in supporting your hard work. And so please feel free to reach out to any of the organizations that are represented here today. Um, and with that, I want to transition over to our Q&A. Um, so if you haven't dropped your question yet, please feel free to do that so that our team over here can filter through it and let me know which panelists can answer what question. So AJC team, let me know if you all are okay with me to start with the first question. Okay, just want to make sure we didn't get anything urgent in the chat that we'd like to address. Okay, so Niyati, um, I'd like to know how can we advocate appropriately and present action steps to the current administration regarding lack of support in place for bilingual students, um, at the same time making sure their individual needs are met.
I think this is building on what Michael just said, that look, the law has not changed, and the funding is still there. And so, for now, take these tools that we've created. There's an FAQ for educators that allow you to understand what is required of you and how to advocate for that. So that's part one. There's an FAQ that's also very detailed for students and communities and families, and a small know your right card that you can easily print out and hand out if needed. Use these tools to understand what is required, and be an ally. It doesn't stop you from advocating more at different state level solutions. And to also consider what additional protections that Fran mentioned might be available in your state, and to make sure that this English learner community is getting the full benefit of all of these resources and protections both.
So what I'm hearing is even if the messaging and behavior at the federal level is not super supportive, there's still ways that we can work together to serve students and educators.
Absolutely. And, if you want to reach out to any of the organizations that are on this webinar or are listed in these materials that we're to circulate, to think about what might be the best path forward in your circumstances, never hesitate to reach out. And we're, happy to think through things with you and think about what other things might be presented in specific circumstances.
Thanks so much. My next question is for Naveen. Um, can you talk about how English learners thrive if they receive the language supports that they need? I'm thinking about the field visits you made and the recommendations that were implemented. What kind of outcome did you find after these language supports were implemented?
Yeah, I mean, I think, maybe the most obvious answer is that research supports, and I saw this while I was at DOJ as well, that when English learners get the supports that they need, they do better academically, and they do better on standardized tests. But we also know that the benefits go well beyond that. The research also shows that English learners are more likely to feel valued, included in their school community, participate in school activities like extracurriculars. And we also know that it's not just English learners who benefit. The entire school community thrives when English learners thrive. English learners and their families are part of the fabric of our communities, and they bring diverse backgrounds and perspectives to schools. And I think it's important to recognize that this is about inclusive education and ensuring inclusive and successful public education for all students.
I have a follow-up question from our audience. This person says, we heard about teachers acting for EL rights. I'm curious about school administrators. Have you found that they are also seeking resources on how to navigate this current situation? And are there trainings or informational sessions for school administrators specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there are trainings specifically for school administrators. I think some of the same principles apply in terms of understanding what the legal obligations are, understanding how and why English learners thrive and why the broader school community thrives when English learners get the support that they need. So what I would say is I think, there are a lot of common threads that administrators and educators can together advocate their school board, their state agencies, and others to get the resources and the supports that they need.
Awesome, thank you. I want to just add here that as someone who has experience with local advocacy in the district level and alongside other parents and educators, sometimes what is helpful is when an administrator hears from a parent or an advocate about a certain need, in this case, like for English language resources. Um, I've seen principals say, okay, I want to support this, but the school board will more likely want to hear from the impacted individuals, such as the family members. And so they may work together to encourage that family member or an advocate that's supporting the family member to speak at the school board meeting to raise this concern, and they can work together to accomplish what it is that they need. So there's a variety of ways to go about it. And perhaps if NEA, you happen to have resources in the near future for school leaders like this in this question, feel free to share, and then we'll make sure that our audience receives those resources as well. All right, so Francisca, this next one is for you. What can advocates do if English learners don't receive accommodations that they need, like language access on state exams? I'm thinking that means like standardized state exams or during classroom instruction time. Oh, okay. Actually, I just got a message from Francisca saying her internet is also acting out. So let me pause on that. Okay. All right, Michael, are you ready? I have one for you.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so there are many multilingual students that come with undiagnosed needs and issues. And when asked, we often hear that there are no tests or surveys to identify the need. It was always a language problem to determine students' needs if the student has a learning concern or some other issue. Do you have recommendations of what to do in such situations?
So apologies if I'm not understanding the question 100%, but I'll do my best. So to be clear, I understand the question to be about perhaps students that also have disabilities and are students who are English learners. And to be clear, there are both federal civil rights laws that protect the rights of students who are English learners and multiple civil rights laws that protect the rights of students with disabilities. For example, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And in general, schools must provide students who are English learners and also have disabilities with both the English learner services and disability related services they are entitled to under federal law. So it's not one or the other, it's both. And in the context of assessing a student who is English learner or assessing a student with a disability, it is important and essential that schools are providing those resources both in a language the student can understand and in a responsive way with respect to their disability. I believe that this might be in the chat or will be in the chat, but the Department of Education previously, in years past, put out a helpful resource specifically on this intersection of rights, and that resource continues to be both accurate and helpful.
Okay, so I think what I'm also hearing is, again, there are rights and there are legal protections and requirements for students with disabilities and for students who have who are English learners. I'm thinking perhaps the person asking is wondering, what do you do when there's no standardized exam or um, exam that's generally used to diagnose the student in the student's language? Are you aware of resources that other schools have turned to solve this issue?
Yeah, I can't say that there's one specific resource in every circumstance, but this is where, educators and folks working at schools working together is important, as Naveen referenced throughout his discussion earlier. when we're talking about a student who may have a disability and is also an English learner, there are folks working with the student in regards to their language services, and there are folks who are required by law to be working together to make determinations about the student's needs with respect to the student's disability. Those groups of people should be working together and should be included in sort of both discussions to ensure that that individual student's needs are being met in the best possible way that they can.
Thanks so much. All right, let's see. Okay, so Natalie helped us drop the fact sheet from Office of Civil Rights here. Um, yeah, it's definitely a bigger topic because it's complicated when you can't get these evaluations in the language that would serve the student. And I'm not saying that it's okay for things to persist that way. Maybe that's just the reality of what we are facing in classrooms today with teacher shortage and not enough not enough opportunities to do the professional development to be equipped for these student needs. But I want to just add a personal note here. I see a lot of names in our attendee chat that signal to me that you might know another language, you might have multiple home languages. And I want to just reassure you that you existing in the classroom already, before you bring any special resource, before you have any kind of translated documents, is such a big deal. I wanted to share that I have a friend who was a third grade teacher, and he had a student who was on the spectrum. The child was Vietnamese American, and the parents were not fluent in English. So an older sister would have to come in to do parent-teacher conferences. He found out that this student in previous grades always cried and screamed when he had to be taken to his special ed class. I guess there was something he was pulled out for. But when this friend became his teacher in third grade, that stopped happening. And this friend is Korean American. So while he's not Vietnamese, obviously, I think there was something comforting to that child that his teacher looked like family to him. And so even though he really deserved more resources to help him learn and feel safe and comfortable at school, just the fact that that teacher that he had that year was an Asian teacher and he felt like he could connect was a big influence. So I just want to encourage all of our educators and school administrators here that are listening in that being you matters already so much. So, thank you so much for um, answering our many questions, panelists. Let me just double check if there's any other things. Um, okay, great. We're going to drop a couple more resources in the chat. And after this webinar is finished, we will follow up with an email in about a week with all the resources so you don't have to worry about copying and pasting the links in case you're driving right now and listening in. So if you have any other questions, you're welcome to reach out to us. I will have someone drop my email in the chat and I can make sure it gets to the right place depending on your question. And please take care and know that we are here to support you. And in the middle of this teacher shortage, we can't afford to lose any of you all. So thank you for your very hard work. And we'll see you again very soon. Take care.